All right. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Sunday School Dropouts podcast. We are excited to have you all here with us today.
Yes, we are. Before we get into it, I want to let people know I'm so excited that we are now offering support groups for religious trauma and the elections through the Center for Trauma Resolution and Recovery. There's 3 different groups that you can join. All of them are online, so it doesn't matter where you are in the United States, you can join them. They're available for adults over the age of 18. We're not telling you how to vote or who to vote for, but we are wanting to provide a place of support and just a sense of connection and resources, because we know that the elections are overwhelming. Sometimes they can feel very lonely and isolating, and it can feel like a time of increased stress. And so we just wanted to be able to provide a resource so that if people need some extra support over the next few weeks, it will be there for you. The groups start on October 23rd and 24th, which is 2 weeks before the elections. So it'll be 5 weeks total, 2 weeks before the elections, the week of the elections, and 2 weeks after, just again, to give you that extra space to be able to kind of process what is happening in your life and feel resourced and supported as we navigate this all together. So go to traumaresolutionandrecovery.com and click the Religious Trauma and the Elections support groups under the Services tab. You'll be able to find out more information as well as sign up. So with that, I'm excited today because we have a great conversation with a fabulous guest in Dan Miller, and I'm thrilled for people to be able to listen to it.
Yeah. Oh, I am too. I'm excited about this one. Very much so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We'll give a formal introduction of Dan in just a few moments, but we're going to be talking all about religious trauma and the elections today under kind of the premise of how fear and trauma is used to drive propaganda, to drive extremism, and to really kind of make people even more fearful. And it's a very interesting conversation that we're having. And Dan is the perfect person to be talking about this with. He just very eloquently explains that connection, the between fear and trauma, and why it is such a powerful tool to use to get people to do what you want.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I remember when we were talking about doing this series, like leading up to the election, in my mind, I was even debating, like, well, how much of this should we do? Because we're not really a political podcast, or we're not trying to be a political podcast. Right. But I don't know. It's just seeing how much it really does so much tie into being trauma informed, trauma healing, nervous system. Education 101, and so much of that is actually playing out with how the narrative around politics and ideology is, how they show up, and just the cultural narrative in our day-to-day life. And so anyway, all of that to say, I'm really grateful that we went ahead and did this series and are continuing to just have conversations like this.
Yeah. So with that, we'll go ahead and get into the episode, but we also just want to recognize that some of the topics that we discuss can evoke emotion or feelings or triggers, and sometimes that requires more processing, or maybe even might be too much to handle right now. So always feel free to take what you need and leave what you don't.
It is time for our prayer request segment, the part of the show where we get to come before God with whatever's on our heart. So Laura, what has God placed upon your heart recently? I'm so curious to hear.
Yeah. God has placed on my heart the brand new, not at all weird timing of Russell Brand and his new convictions and I don't know, position in Christianity. Christian nationalism. He has just made quite a splash in some very literal ways, but also some figurative ways. And I just think we need to lift him up and have some holy gossip about him today.
I couldn't agree more. Russell Brand is an interesting guy. I mean, and not even just recently. I mean, just the way that he's popped up in news within pop culture just over the last 10, 15 years. I don't know. It's always something interesting, I feel like.
It is interesting because, you know, he used to be married to Katy Perry.
Mm-hmm.
And
I remember that.
her whole backstory is in conservative evangelical Christianity. You know, obviously she had come out of it prior to marrying Russell Brand. But it is so interesting to like, it's like this weird, almost like full circle, but in a opposite way type of thing, that now, you know, she's definitely out of it, has been out of it for quite some time, and now he, you know, he's gotten into it. But I feel like the timing of it is pretty, well, as the kids say today, sus.
Yeah, it absolutely is. You know, it's one of those things where it's like, if the man has genuinely converted to Christianity and that's meaningful to him, like, cool, whatever. Like,
sure,
you get to do what you want. You're an adult. But it is so interesting, the timing, being the election year, and the fact that by his own admission, he's only been a Christian for 3 months, which is fine. I mean, I'm not trying to gatekeep things. Like, okay, so you're a brand new Christian, and but let's just jump right to it. You're already giving prayers at a Tucker Carlson-led conference.
Yeah.
Like, okay, that's interesting. Not that you need to be a Christian for X amount of years before you're allowed to publicly pray. That's not the point. But it is so very interesting how back in the day he was kind of I don't know what he was. There were parts of him that kind of struck me as left-leaning, libertarian-ish. I know libertarians aren't particularly left, but like very, I don't know, but now he's kind of become part of that whole right-wing conspiratorial. I mean, literally in his prayer, I don't know if you heard it or saw the transcript from it, like he directly names, among other things, like the deep state. I mean, it's just so,
oh my gosh,
it's so, yeah. He literally says, this wasn't how he opened, but middle of the prayer, he says, quote, "I pray in your name," meaning God, "that the forthcoming election be an opportunity for unity, for America and for Americans, for forgiveness and for grace, that the dark," and here, this is underline this part, "that the dark and demonic forces that appear to operate at the level of the state, the deep state, and the corporate and global world experience your light, Lord." That is a direct quote.
So he knows all the terms.
Oh, he does.
He knows all like the buzzwords. But you know what I also think is so interesting is that this is, and I'm trying to find the exact dates here, but okay, so this conversion experience is also, it's not only connected to the elections, and you know, of course, he's being propped up by a lot of very far right news anchors and figures, right? But he also has been accused of all sorts of sexualized violence and emotional abuse. And there was a big story that came out in September of 2023 that detailed all of this. So it's just interesting that this all came to light, and then he has this conversion experience. And I think what's worth noting is that a conversion experience in the mind of so many people inside of high control religions wipes the slate clean of anything that you've done, including crimes, because all sin is equal at the foot of the cross. And now that this person is claiming to be saved by Jesus, it's like, yeah, that stuff doesn't matter. And we should actually prop him up as a leader, as somebody who is worth listening to, and kind of as a figure. And I mean, we should not be surprised. This is what they did. They've done this with many people, including their candidate for president currently, thinking about all of the sexualized violence claims with him as well. It's blowing me away, but also not at all surprising. It's
not. Well, it's like, gosh, not even forgotten about some of those allegations and the stuff that going at him. But it's like, yeah, I guess it makes sense that you're dealing with some of that backlash that, just jump into the system where men in power aren't held accountable for harm. So that tracks.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And as long as you ask for forgiveness from holy God, then really you don't have to deal with any sort of consequences.
And it's like, and not only is it the not dealing with, but now not only that, but you can be praised. It's like, not only are you no longer the villain, but now you're a story of God's redeeming grace. It's like, look at what a horrible human being you were. Look at all these horrible things you did, but God reached your heart, and now here you are, and now you're.
Yeah.
leading prayers at conferences, and I forgot where this one photo was of him baptizing. I don't even know what river this was. It doesn't matter. But
I think it was the Thames. How do you say it? Thames River.
Yeah.
It's the same river that he was
England.
baptized in, and now he's baptizing others in his tidy whities, which is like
I was thinking that
whatever,
too.
you know.
I know. I'm like, what the hell is this? Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh man.
I mean, like, on the one hand, I will say, on the one hand, I was like, oh, yeah, he is definitely what is considered a baby Christian, because, those who are, more in their faith would not dream of doing something like that. So there's like this level of innocence, but also then being like, it's Russell Brand. Like, is that innocent, or was this like a great photo op?
Yeah, it's so interesting too. There's even bits of it that, just the fact that like one day he decided he was a Christian and now he's doing all these things like that.
Yeah.
It kind of actually reminds me of the narrative of Paul. It's like, well, who the hell are you? It's like you were literally an enemy of the church. Then one day you decided you had this experience, and now you've shown back up as a self-proclaimed leader.
Yeah.
And yet humble bragging. Like, I mean, literally another thing he said, Russell Brand said this. He's like, and it might have been the Tucker Carlson interview, but he said something to the effect of, I'm not about the brand of Russell Brand anymore. It's about service to Jesus Christ, which sounds so great, but that is, it's like, it's just such a, so disingenuous. I don't know. 'Cause it's like, but the thing is, that is the brand. And it sounds so good to people who claim they value, humility and all of things like that. But it's like, you're still very much about a brand, dude. You're just, part of the brand is not being honest about the fact of what's actually going on when it comes to some of these right-wing organizations and people. But it's so that's what struck me this morning. It's like, gosh, this actually kind of reminds me when we were talking about Paul a few episodes back, or, know, and it's like this, like you said, grifters, an ultimate grifter. Yeah. It's like, you're going to go to where it most benefits you. And right now, this is it. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, it is wild. And I do remember, growing up in the church and, also being in a position of leadership, both volunteer and paid leadership, there was definitely it wasn't like you had to be a Christian for X amount of months or years or whatever. Like, it wasn't explicitly said, but there was like an understanding that if you were going to be holding a position of leadership within the church, you were in a more quote unquote mature walk with God. Like, you weren't this baby Christian because you just, hadn't had time to grow in your faith, which, I can actually respect, like, from a leadership model of saying, like, yeah, we would want people who have experience in some of these, places to be, I don't know, leading or facilitating or, whatever. I can understand and even respect that. But I'm just like, it is so interesting that, but when it serves them, like, then we can have a quote unquote baby Christian that we can not only excuse all of this terrible, violent, illegal, abusive behavior, but we can also just put them in a place of leadership and say, hey, follow this guy. It just, I don't know. It's just such a departure from how so many of us grew up.
Yeah. No, it totally is. It's, you said it earlier, like, it's not really surprising, and it's not really surprising, but it's amazing to see. And I don't know. It makes me wonder too, and maybe this is too much of an apples to oranges comparison, because maybe the allegations against Russell Brand pale in comparison, but it's like, I wonder what would have happened had, 6 months ago Diddy wholeheartedly jumped into the Christian evangelical bandwagon.
Yeah.
Would what we're seeing now be different? Would other powerful forces in this country be having his back? Because right now he's pretty thrown under the bus, and really all he's got is the fact that he's got loads of money to help him out right now. But it's like, I don't know, like, had he maybe jumped into that right-wing evangelical camp, like, I don't know. But I don't know. But
it is interesting.
There's a lot of other angles to that too, because I also could recognize the way he's being treated in the media versus like Russell Brand, like the fact that Diddy's black, Russell Brand is a white Englishman.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. Well, it is interesting because I won't say the name of this person, but there is a pretty big Christian influencer, in that world. And she used to be a big time fitness influencer, just like, was everywhere, tons and tons and tons of followers. And something happened with her business. She was like selling some products or something. I don't know the exact details of it, but basically was found to be a fraud, and that she was doing things very unethically and maybe even illegally. I don't want to get all, I don't remember, like I said, I don't remember all the details. Anyways, she was advised by her PR team to come out and say that she was a Christian. Now, she wasn't, like, she hadn't grown up that way. She wasn't at that present time. But they said, if you embrace this identity, there's this whole community of people that will accept you, embrace you, and essentially platform you. And that is exactly what happened. And now she is a pretty big time Christian influencer. So much so that Mark Driscoll, who absolutely refuses to view female social media, post about them, anything, actually reposted a video of hers and very positive commentary of the work that God was doing in this person's life. And I was like, wow, like this is interesting. And it's just very well known behind the scenes that she knew that evangelicals love a really great redemption story, a really good testimony of how God saved you. And, and it worked, right? And I feel like that's maybe a little bit of what's happening, what's advisable in situations like these is saying like, hey, just proclaim belief over here, whether it's Russell Brand or, I have no idea what Diddy's, religious background is or what he would, be convicted of in prison, by the Holy Ghost, not by a court of law.
Yeah, different conviction. I knew what you meant. I know what you meant, though.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see. But yeah, it is such a bizarre world that we're in.
Yes, it is. Wow.
Yeah. So does that mean that you are going to start baptizing people in rivers in your tidy whities?
Oh my gosh. Well, I mean, if I thought
you do go on a lot of missions trips.
I mean, yeah. I mean, there's always a possibility that I could, kind of rebrand myself, and that could be another thing, I suppose.
Yeah, side hustle. Today, we are excited to have Dan Miller back on the podcast. Dan is a practitioner at the Center for Trauma Resolution and Recovery and works with clients who are dealing with religious trauma and adverse religious experiences, faith deconstruction, legacies of purity culture, LGBTQ plus identity, allyship, and parenting, loss of social community and shared meaning, transitions within or out of professional ministry positions, and changing experiences of masculinity. Dan collaborates with his clients to help find ways to process their traumas so they can be at home in their own bodies and the world around them, leading daily lives that are meaningful and fulfilling. In addition to seeing clients, Dan is also a professor of religion at Landmark College and is the co-host of the podcast Straight White American Jesus, which is the most listened to podcast on religion and politics. The podcast takes an in-depth look at culture and politics, and we are so excited to have Dan back with us today in our mini-series on religious trauma and politics. Welcome, Dan Miller, to the Sunday School Dropouts podcast. It's good to have you here again.
Thanks, Laura, for having me. It's always a lot of fun.
Yes. I'm excited to talk to you. I know the last time you were here, we talked all about being in ministry and some of the interesting healing parts coming out of ministry. And this time, we're going to be talking about something that's right in your academic wheelhouse, your podcaster extraordinaire wheelhouse, which I'm really excited for. So, we're going to jump in to the questions because we're talking today all things about Christian nationalism and trauma, because that's always fitting, right? So, Dan, I'm just curious to know from you, just to start off the conversation, what would you say is the correlation between Christian nationalism and trauma?
Yeah, so I'm glad you asked that. I know we talked some before, and it's something I've been sort of thinking about. And I think it's good's not the right word. It's useful or instructive, right? That we get Christian nationalism on full display all the time as we're coming into like the election cycle and stuff. Mm-hmm. Because one of the things that steered me toward your work and looking more at trauma and different things like this is, years ago now, God, I can't believe it's been almost a decade, right? Since the whole Trump train started. Mm-hmm. People asking me about the sort of, they would say the irrationality of the sort of Christian nationalist movement. I don't like the language of irrationality. I don't think these people are certifiable or crazy or anything like that, but I think it is non-rational in certain ways. And what struck me way back then is if people remember the Unite the Right rally and like the tiki torches and the images that came out, just the anger and the emotion and people would say, why can't I talk to my dad about this without it turning into a screaming match? Or why don't facts matter? Or whatever. And I say all of that as a lead up because I think that a huge part of what drives Christian nationalism and lots of other movements, right? Lots of other identities is emotion and affect, like really, really strongly, right? It's not about beliefs understood in this really cognitive sense of I hold these beliefs and therefore I'll go vote this way. And I started thinking about that, and I was like, I think that trauma plays into this in a number of ways. One is, and I would love your thoughts on this as the trauma expert. It's like I feel like I'm doing like an oral defense or something. I'm going to throw these out, and then my examiners will be like, no, Dan, I'm sorry, this is never going to air because you're really wrong.
Yeah, I'll take notes in the background if you hear me typing.
I think that on one hand, you have sort of broadly traumatic experiences that lots of people have experienced, right? And if we want to, put our geeky political theory, American history hats on, you have, for example, huge swaths of like white middle America who have had wage stagnation for decades, who have not been able to get ahead the way that their parents or grandparents did, who feel, they have these visions of what, quote unquote, the American dream was and how it's not that anymore and so forth. And that is traumatizing. That is a fact. Like anybody who's had to go to bed at night and they're like, I don't know if I can pay the insurance next month. I don't know. Like I'm working really hard. I'm doing everything I can. And I don't know if I can make ends meet. That can be its own kind of trauma. And where I think Christian nationalism comes in and says, all right, we're going to really play on that. So we're going to tell you, and we're going to have this narrative for decades that trauma is because of brown people coming across the border, or that trauma is because somehow queer people exist and they're the reason, right? Or it's maybe it's divine judgment on a country that's lost its moral way or whatever. And so you can have, I think, legitimately traumatic experiences that collectives of people can experience that can be tapped into by Christian nationalists to sort of feed it. And I think that when we talk about, obviously there can be lots of kinds of trauma experiences and trauma responses, but the emotions that we see with that, fear, anger, resentment, violence, right? All of these are ways of reacting to trauma, as you know better than I do. I think that's one way, is tapping into real sort of cultural traumas. I think another one is sort of manufacturing traumas, right? You tell populations that you have been under threat for decades, that you're under assault, that you've lost the country, that people are out to get you, that again, if queer folk can get married, somehow this is a threat to you if you're a married person who's not queer, that if women can have premarital sex, somehow this is a threat to you if that's not something you want to do, or, and you create this sense of all of those negative emotions. And as you talk about in your work, right, trauma is individual. And by that, I mean, there's a certain sense in which it doesn't matter if the stuff that people assign that fear to, if the people that they blame are actually blameworthy, have actually done anything. What matters is the effect, the way that it is embodied in those people, the way that it feeds off when you get a crowd of people all chanting and reinforcing each other and feeding off of that fear and that anger and that really negative energy and so forth. And I think all of that is something that people behind Christian nationalism at present, they've been feeding that and stoking those fears and telling that story for decades at this point. In fact, I would argue that part of what Christian nationalism and lots of nationalisms, right, thrive on is a perpetual sense of threat, right? If part of trauma is that our nervous systems are all turned up and heightened and perceiving threat all the time and just always in this agitated state, and we get into, for my clients, I always call it kind of an emotional muscle memory. It's like it's there, it's on all the time, it's a habit. We live in a society where millions of Americans have been habituated to feel that and be triggered by certain populations for decades, so that when they see a person of color, when they see a queer couple holding hands, when they see somebody and think that they maybe identify as trans or whatever it is, all of those emotions kick up, which for them legitimates exactly what they've been told. Of course, these people are a threat. I feel threatened. Right? Yeah. If they weren't a threat, I wouldn't be afraid of them. If they weren't, right? And so I think it feeds actively on that trauma. And then the last point, I feel like I'm talking a lot here, but the last point is, I think the classic trauma response, it's like the bully phenomenon. Like everybody who knows anything about trauma knows that if you are traumatized, say growing up or something, guess what? Good chance you're going to traumatize others when you come along, and we can call that generational trauma. We can call that the sort of abuser syndrome that most people who abuse have been abused. You get the same thing, and so part of the expression of that trauma is to do what? To inflict pain on others, to make others fear, to scare others, to intimidate others, to do to them what you feel has been done to you. All of which I think is a trauma response. None of it makes it legitimate. I think it's right. that explains it. That doesn't make it okay when we say it's partially a trauma response. But I see that aspect of trauma as really central to Christian nationalism and the energy that feeds it, sort of in our contemporary context.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think about the work of Resmaa Menakem. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him. He wrote kind of best-selling book is My Grandmother's Hands, but he talks about that idea of generational trauma, really how it is woven into our DNA. And then we have, I guess the best way to say it would be like these subconscious biases that then are played out with other people. So whether it's, this person because of the color of their skin, because of their gender, because of their sexuality, their socioeconomic status are in front of me, and I'm not even consciously realizing how like that I might be defending myself, or that I might be in this hypervigilant posture or whatever. It just happens because it's so deeply woven within us. And it reminds me too of how, like, in high control religion, that fear piece is also woven into our DNA. And it feels like this perfect marriage of high control religion that thrives on a revved up nervous system, constantly activated, and nationalism also thriving on the same things, and putting them together and calling it holy or something like that.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I often say to people is that these phenomena, right, whether we're talking about trauma responses, everybody has a nervous system, right? You don't have to be religious to have a nervous system. You're not going to be religious to experience trauma. But what religion often does is take these sort of universal features and turn the volume way up. It's like having a mixing board with a slider, and you just turn it way up. And now we have, say, transcendent legitimations for this. Or as you say, we're feeling threatened all the time. And like your best case scenario in high control religion is that the God who supposedly loved you is also this threat standing over you all the time if you get out of line. So yeah, we're completely programmed to remain in that sort of hyper threat detection, threat evasion system. And then when you can aim that at people, it becomes a really potent weapon.
Yeah. Actually, and on that note, I think that's a really good, like, kind of unpacking this role between fear and propaganda. We've been dancing around it, touching on it already, but that just seems like such an important thing to really just get into, because propaganda just is so fear driven. And what we've been talking about, like what you said a moment ago about, this is a paraphrase, but basically like it's almost like it doesn't matter if it's true, but that doesn't change the fact that how it becomes embodied in the collective nervous system of society and of different groups, and in this case white evangelicals, as we're talking about white Christian nationalism. And so back to just the role that fear and propaganda, how they kind of play into one another.
Yeah, fear and
really
propaganda,
important.
and tied in with propaganda, I would add propaganda has been around long in time, but I mean, so has misinformation. But I think the two really fit together, right? And yeah, so I think there's, for me, the propaganda piece. You're right. It's about keying those emotions. And by emotion I mean those, including the embodied responses and all of that, everything that goes into the complexity of emotion. So propaganda is for, right, is to keep that state active, right, in the absence of a legitimate threat. That's why you need to have, once upon a time, for old people like me, posters that would be in places, or it's why you need to have clickbait titles now, if we want to think about it that way, or it's why you've got to have little TikTok things that you can click on and consume really fast that are aimed at doing what? At keeping us in that state. The dynamic that I think is interesting there is that I feel like it lives in this tension between, on the one hand, assigning cause, again, because propaganda, if we're talking about politics, we're talking about elections, we're talking about Christian nationalism, it needs concrete targets, right? It needs real enemies, especially for things like, say, economic insecurity, which is this really amorphous, general kind of thing. It's hard for us to get our heads and our bodies and our minds around it. But if I can point at somebody and say, that person is the threat, that person's the threat, then I've got something concrete, while at the same time, I think propaganda also has to make the threat ephemeral, so it's always alive, because I think propaganda has to operate by making a threat that's always constant. So there's nothing you could do to solve it. Politicians will stand up and tell us they'll fix things, but they don't actually want to fix things, because if they could be fixed, the threat would go away. So they have to keep the threat there. So you get this, for me, this constant interplay between targeting real causes, assigning real causes to these affects that we have, that, as Laura is saying, people may not even be aware that they have, but at the same time keeping it ephemeral enough that threat will never go away. And I think that's what propaganda does. So if really effective propaganda does that by keeping us in this kind of perpetual state of often negative emotions. And we should point out, right, negative emotions can feel really good. That's the weird thing about them, right? It can feel really good to rage and to be angry and to lash out and, and so forth. Keeping that alive and keeping it targeted, but also keeping it loose enough that we can always maintain that state of fear. And again, Laura, to your point, high control religion, or a tradition of, say, millennialism within American Christianity, this sense of like, the end is always nigh, the end can always come. I mean, the Christian tradition's been saying that for 2,000 years, that it's right around the corner, it could happen at any moment, and it doesn't matter that it hasn't happened for 2,000 years. I think, again, it feeds that same kind of propagandistic dimension.
Yeah, that is a good example. And then just that specifically, just looking at how the last 200 years with specifically American Christian fundamentalism, since the Second Great Awakening. I mean, my background is Seventh-day Adventism, and so I know very well about American-born, apocalyptic-oriented
so you
ideologies.
Know your apocalypticism, right? That's that's
unfortunately very much embodied. Still is a little bit, I'll be honest. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just the left behind kid over here,
Well, see, you guys got to skip the apocalypse, right? All the left behind crowd is like, if we just do the stuff right, we'll get raptured out. It'll be okay. And we'll just write the book about the people who missed out and got stuck in the apocalypse. But
Yeah, exactly. But I think that goes to your point even too of this idea of having to point your finger at a target, but also keeping it really elusive of it's never going to be solved. It just kind of reminds me of we as humans really love solidity, concrete certainty, which I think both of these systems that we're talking about, high control religion, evangelicalism, nationalism, thrive on that. This idea of we can have a sense of certainty if, and then fill in the blank. We do these things. We believe these things. We get these politicians into office. And then of course we know nothing changes, both in the religious sense and in the political sense. But that's, I think, it really can drive that fear. It's always this idea of here's the thing, we just need to do these things and then the good thing will happen. Yeah, but it never comes to pass, which is why I think this is maybe a totally different topic, but why I think, with the whole Roe v. Wade overturn, they're now kind of like, oh shit, what do we do with this? Because we finally did the thing that we said we were supposed to do, and it didn't turn out. And now we don't have another way to like continue to propagate these messages.
It's the dog that caught the car, right?
Yeah.
Suddenly like has no idea what to do with it. Yeah. Exactly. It's kind of hanging onto the bumper for dear life, being like, what did I just do?
Yeah, exactly. They didn't know what was actually going to happen. But yeah, so back to this idea of propaganda. I know I've done a little bit of research. I think first became aware of this in Sarah Mosliner's work, where she talks about how high control groups, and not just religion, but within a lot of different systems, even we look at purity culture, this plays into it too, kind of targeting certain age groups or age ranges of people, adolescents, why that occurs. I have thoughts, but I'm curious to know from you, why do you think that is?
Yeah, it's. I think it's get them while they're young, but not too young, right? Like, you know a lot more about brains and brain development than I do, but we know now, right, that the parts of the brains that Westerners have always thought are the primary parts, the logic and the rationality, that stuff doesn't sort of settle in until like 25 now, mid 20s. Yep. Now, but we recognize now that it's like mid 20s. Yeah. So you have this phase of adolescence, however we want to define that. And I have an adolescent living in my home. And so I feel like I'm like living in some of this where it's this weird mix, right? Of like more adult, more independent, but also still really capable of being shaped, very still childish in lots of ways, very malleable. And I think that's exactly the time when people want to target that is when people, I think, are old enough to start having social agency. Maybe that's a way to think about it, right? They're old enough to start doing things in the world. We let people vote at 18, right? I guess the framers didn't know the whole 25 thing, right? Or maybe it would be 25. People can start driving. They start being sexually active. They start exercising more autonomy over their own bodies, like all of those kinds of things. And yet they can still be shaped in really, really fundamental ways. And I think that that's a key part of that targeting. I think another part is that you're getting them while all that's going on, but most 16, 17, 18-year-olds are not living out on their own. They're not independent yet. You get the sort of prolonged adolescence thing. So again, you're trying to shape them so that by the time they are in their mid-20s to late 20s and are really starting to properly adult, they've still been shaped by these ways. And I think in some of it within church circles, without the brain science stuff, people have known this for decades, right? The importance of youth group, the importance of shaping kids at that age, the importance of socializing them into this before they go off to college and are led astray, or, before they meet partners that they're going to marry, or inculcating these habits so that they will carry those through to their own kids, and, sort of on and on and on. So I think that there are a lot of really strategic reasons and really just logical reasons why that's an age range where people are targeting them. I think that it's that tension of somebody who has enough agency to do things in the world, but they're not fully independent yet, and they're not fully capable of making their own decisions. It's a really fertile ground. Yeah.
Well, and I think about too, like, I think it's like usually around age 20 is when your ego is at its height, and I think about like when I was at 20, or I think even, within purity culture, Josh Harris, he writes this book when he's 20 and like adamantly defends it because at 20, everything, and at 20, I knew everything. And I was like passionate and zealous about, in my case, the messages of my religion. But I feel like that has to play into it as well. So you get them while they're young, their brains are still malleable, and they're a bit fearless because they believe that they are right. And they will passionately defend themselves and their causes, which is great in some ways. But then I think, when we're talking about these systems of control, you get them young and then they go and marry and recreate more of that. I feel like that's, my parents' generation. Well, I mean, still, even after our generation, like how many peers do we have that was the path that was followed? Yeah.
I think just on that point real quick, when you highlight that, I think the other thing about, I have things that I think and I think I'm right about, and, But I think I sound so old now. Once you get to a certain age, you start to realize, you kind of look back, you're like, man, I thought I was so independent and I kind of blended into the crowd. And like, but I think that's the other piece is they are malleable, but there's this kind of just not recognition of that. And so I feel like there's a potent mix there as well. I know lots of adults who will say, I think this, but I'm not sure if I think this because I really do, or if that's just how I was brought up, or maybe it's because, I don't know, I like this group of people more. Like there's a kind of reflective awareness of some of those things that can shape us in a way that I think often, again, for adolescents, late adolescents, early adults, whatever title we want to use, that just isn't there yet. And I laugh because I work with college students all day, and you sort of see this on display in the classroom on a regular basis.
Oh gosh. Yeah.
Well, it's like that age is so incredibly idealistic, and I don't say that critically. I think it's like one of those things that's like really cool. But like there's also, I mean, and I'll even just speak to my own experience of being that age. Like I do remember how, because at that point in my life, I was, fervently into my church, which was Adventism. And, it's like I had all the answers. And I mean, I was out to just take over the world. I mean, for Jesus, of course, but whatever. So
it was a good takeover, right?
It's nice to know we all would have been friends back then too,
Yeah. Well, maybe because Adventism is kind of, has its phobia of everybody who's not Adventist, but that's a tangent. But
you wouldn't have been allowed to. So
right.
That's true.
Yeah.
If you'd been allowed to be friends, we could have been like secret friends or something.
Yeah. Pen pals, since we didn't really have email back then.
I know.
At least I didn't.
No, I didn't either. Not for a long time.
How would you say that, going back to this idea of like adolescence, Christian nationalism, what are some of the ways that we see Christian nationalism specifically targeting that age range?
Yeah, one, even beyond, if we just talk about church life, right? And whatever the line between churches and Christian nationalism is, and that can move around a lot. But, Andrew kind of, I think, was sort of alluding to this even just a few minutes ago. But church life is built around this kind of whole life system, right? It's supposed to be kind of a cradle to grave model. It's there all the time. But if you read, thinking back to my pastor days in a pretty young church in a metro area, and if people talk about strategies for growing your church or planting your church, like what is it? It's children. Why? To get the parents in, young parents with young children. So some of the people that are maybe a little bit past that 20 age, but 20 to 30. And youth and young adult, we used to call them singles, Christian singles, because anybody who wasn't married was eventually going to get married. That was the the singles ministry. But I mean, it was built around really holding people in that kind of age range, from say like mid-teens to 30, right? An age range there. That was the core demographic around which you were going to build your church. So everything you did was built at that core demographic and meeting their needs and bringing them in and so forth. So let's just sprinkle the Christian nationalism piece in there. Let's bring in the nationalism. Let's bring in the populism. Let's get that into the sermons. Let's get to where people are reading the Bible that way. Let's get to that. That's the theological interpretation. It's ready-made for that. It's got this really pre-existing structure that builds that right in. And I think there's so many things that turn up the volume on that. The creation of social media echo chambers, the rise of 24-hour news services, and people can just sort of hear whatever they want to hear. I think all of that maps onto it. And I think where we see it now is like all the statistics showing that is surprising to some people that lots of, for example, Gen Z men are like being really drawn to these messages about masculinity and quote unquote traditional femininity and all of that. And it's really thrown some people off. But I'm like, it's the core demographic that this stuff is aimed at. And there it is. There it is, taking root within these contexts.
Yeah. It's interesting because I've dipped my toe into that research area. I find it to be fascinating of why is it that so many young men, so under 30, are really kind of moving into these more extreme groups or extreme sides of the pendulum, I guess we could say. Yeah, and it feels like they, along like nationalism, Christian nationalism, high control religion, really do play on these needs for connection, human value, just identity, and in that, what they're promising, they promise those things so long as they believe specific messages and stand for certain things, do certain things, which is really terrifying because it feels so calculated. And these are young men in this case that are, going to look for people to create the same dynamics, whether it's in who they marry and children they produce. I'm fascinated. And it's preying on basic needs is what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Something else that just occurred to me. I think out loud, so we'll see if this is a good thought or not. But it just occurred to me. But I mean, Andrew, I think this ties right in what you're saying about the kind of apocalyptic dimension. Is the other thing that especially a kind of apocalyptically inflected kind of Christianity, right? We're always at the end times. Is that the people that are hearing that sermon are always the center of the story. It's always about them, right? Whoever's hearing that apocalyptic story, they're the secret players. They are the ones that God is going to come back and rescue. They are the ones that God is going to use in some special way. Long history of apocalypticism appealing to marginalized communities for exactly that reason and so forth. But it maps onto other things. It maps onto that ego piece that you're talking about, right? It's... You're 20, not only do you know everything, but like you're really important. Nobody may know it, but that's their loss, right? The world should know that you are the core, you are the focus, and you again, you map all those on, and that kind of religious messaging feeds into that. The Christian nationalism tells a group of people who wants to hear that they are the center of something important, that they are the center of something important, that it's vital that they go out and ban books or vote for MAGA representatives or whatever it is. Right. Once again, I think a certain inflection within popular American Christianity feeds that, because who doesn't want to be the center of a cosmic story? Like that's, again, it feels great to know that is who you are. Maybe when other times in your life, it doesn't feel like it.
Yeah. It is interesting too, just talking about, I think we touched on this a few minutes ago, but so some of my background, I've been like a school therapist and anyway, a number of different school systems, but like I've worked a lot with, I actually like working with teenagers. A lot of folks don't. I actually like them. But it's interesting though, because I do see so clearly both, Christian fundamentalism, but also nationalism. And it would be interesting to look at the Venn diagram of those, the intersection of those two things, certainly. But seeing how young white men are so very targeted and radicalized, on the one hand, I know it's shocking and surprising, and I've even read whole op-eds about, oh my God, how is this happening? But also it's not that surprising when you really look at it. When you get this messaging of these high control, like the propaganda we talked about, this fear-driven propaganda, where you tell these, you have this message of like this narrative of victimhood, this persecution fantasy of like, for one thing that I hear a lot of is like how this generation economically is the first in a long time in this country is going to be poorer than their parents, and how the reason for that, these horrible liberal policies that are letting folks come in from the southern border. I mean, that's just one example. There's a lot of other scapegoats too, I'm sure, but that's one example. And so, like we were saying, like there's this marginalized group that becomes now they're the target. Like now they're the reason that this horrible thing is happening to you. And they're the reason that you can't, speak your mind as a straight white male or whatever. And it is remarkable how you have these 15, 16, 17 or 25-year-old guys that, they're eating it up. That's what they're hearing. And it's like, the communities of like, it's like on social media, like whether it be TikTok, Snapchat, or like, some of the more like Reddit, or what's the other one? Discord. Like when it comes to like gaming communities and Twitch, like this is actually pretty rampant and commonplace, this type of rhetoric. And anyway, I'm not sure. I guess I'm just sort of wondering aloud and just noticing this. Like, and I have noticed it for the last decade, really. Like it's only been increasing and increasing, especially with this current election cycle that we're on. But, just seeing it play out, this fear-driven propaganda and the targeting of young white men. I mean, among others, but it's remarkable in the worst way possible to see.
Yeah.
How do you, I'm curious to know from y'all, like, how do you see the quote unquote biblical manhood conversation playing into this? Because I see some like crossover. And I know we're going to be talking with Angela Denker. I know Kristen Cobes-Dumais talks about this in Jesus and John Wayne, but it feels like, something we all grew up with this idea of biblical manhood, biblical womanhood, and whatever. It's becoming more extreme and then moving out into the culture that's supposedly non-religious. But now, of course, we know that, there is such a huge crossover between them. So yeah, I mean, I know I didn't warn you about that question, but I'd be curious to know from both of you.
Yeah, Andrew, go ahead. You can kick us off here.
I'm taking notes. Just kidding.
Yeah. Oh, I definitely think that's something that narrative is being utilized. And it is definitely one that it's not even just in the overtly religious community. It's just, I've just seen it as being like the cultural, Western cultural values in general, like that idea of like gender roles. And then when it comes to propaganda, like anxiety and fear around gender roles, sexuality, and how that's, really being used as a means to push different agendas that usually make LGBTQ folks, or drag queens. That was the one within the last couple of years, like, the whole issue with like drag queen story hour. I just remember that was a big thing. I mean, that's just one example, but, I definitely do see like biblical gender roles, the idea of biblical manhood versus biblical womanhood is very much being some motivating pieces and different things that are being pushed and different people that are being targeted, marginalized identities that are now being targeted and scapegoated.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there's a boomerang effect here, maybe is the right analogy, where I think that you get into a real chicken egg thing, I think, sometimes about whether broad cultural conceptions of gender informed how religion articulated gender versus how religion articulated gender shaped broad cultural perceptions. Definitely a relationship. But I think it's fair to say, and certainly within, the white Christian world that is primarily the driver of Christian nationalism in the U.S. at present, for a long time, what we would call biblical manhood or womanhood, right? That what's become that rallying cry, it broadly was a cultural norm. Right? Like the cis, white, single earner man, head of the family, all of that was the ideal. That was a cultural ideal. Maybe not always a cultural norm, but it was supposed to be the norm. It's what everybody aspired to. Then you get that starting to break down, right? You get the women's rights movement. You get queer rights movements. You get African-American civil rights movements that also challenge, I think, traditional conceptions of white gender and patriarchy and purity and stuff in various ways. You get all of those things that happen, and it becomes more apparent, I think, that wasn't, quote-unquote, just manhood. That's not just what men are. It was a very specific conception of manhood, womanhood, whatever. And so there's been almost, a sort of reclaiming of that and trying to bring it back out into culture, where when I think what has happened to some extent, I don't want to sit here and be like, the norm of the white cis male went away for a while. It didn't go away. But it was not uncontested in the way I think that culturally it was for a really long time in America. And so I think it's less so much about bringing something from the church into the world or from religion into the world as this kind of rebound against the pushback against what had been a very traditional and unquestioned conception of gender. And again, just kind of now amped up with this. You get the language of a kind of reappropriation of the language of identity, right? Of Brad and I in Straight White American Jesus have been talking a lot about the radical traditional Catholic piece of this, and J.D. Vance, and this explicit appropriation of this as a Christian movement, as a religious movement, which it always was, but that was sort of masked for a long time because it was religiously hegemonic in a way that it isn't. And so it's sort of reemerged, and I don't know if any of that makes sense or if I'm just giving word salads at this point. But I think that's the interesting piece of it is you had like a backlash against a norm, and now you have the backlash against the backlash, this kind of reverb effect, trying to reassert what had been an American norm and now is not the norm that it once was.
Yeah. I like that idea of the boomerang effect. It reminded me a little bit of Carl Zimmerman's work, his book, Family and Civilization, where he talks about, kind of the rise and fall of different superpower countries, and noticing the rise comes with patriarchy and the quote unquote fall comes with equality, even though we know it's not actually a fall. But yeah, as you're talking about this, that boomerang thing of going, when we get to a point where the person or people or group on top senses that they are losing their power, kind of on the downhill or whatever, I feel like they grasp on so much tighter, digging their heels in. The rally cries become stronger and more vitriolic and shrill. And I wonder if that plays into it too, of going, we've had all these rights movements, in the last decade. And now this idea of equality, like I think Tim Walz said it great. I mean, it's like equality isn't a pie that's running out, it's like, we have it for everybody. And yeah, but then the people on top feel like, oh gosh, my piece of the pie is going to be taken away if everybody gives pie. And so we like grasp onto it. And I wonder if that's where we see some more of this extreme movement, both within Christian nationalism as well as what we're talking about, like the targeting of young men. I don't know. That's just my random thoughts.
There's some. I'm going to forget which scholar I'm taking this from. So sorry, whoever you are. But in studying populism, somebody that I came across when I was writing my book talks about what he describes as a power devaluation crisis, right? And so when you have social groups that have had a near monopoly, right, historically speaking, on social, political, cultural power, when that is contested, in other words, people want their piece. They want to exercise power and authority as well. It provokes this crisis. This crisis. Yeah. And we're right back into that language then of like, oh, crisis. Oh, here we come. That's trauma. That's triggering. That's feeding that sense of crisis and threat and so forth. And, the last point I think that's really important, and Laura, this ties with what you just said, right, is that equality doesn't have to be like a zero-sum game. If they have rights, it doesn't mean I don't. We fall into the trap sometimes being like, everybody wins if we have equality. And I tell students all the time, I'm like, that's true unless you've been winning through inequality. If your group has actually benefited from others being marginalized and not having the same rights you have, equality is a threat. And I think that's a big part of this for a certain segment of white American men, instead of being like, wow, it turns out, like, I don't know, maybe there's different ways to be masculine, or maybe being a man doesn't mean what my grandpa thought it did, or, whatever, different ways to respond to that. But I think that trauma, it just brings it back to that trauma response piece, I think, in really key ways.
That's so insightful. Yeah.
That's really, was it the phrase power devaluation? Was that the phrase?
A power devaluation crisis. As a driving force of kind of populist nationalist movements. Yeah. No, that makes so much sense. And I like that phrase too, because I don't remember. So I'm quoting somebody, paraphrasing. I don't remember who it was either, but just the idea that, if you're from a group that's been accustomed to having power, equality will feel like oppression, and understandably, you're going to fight back. Yeah. And so I do think we see a lot of that happening, and with the propaganda, but also just how folks are actually responding to a lot of things over this past 4 years, past 8 years. I mean, gosh, I don't know, past decade and a half, really. I mean, I'm thinking all the way back to the Tea Party movement, where the murmurings of what we're now dealing with were really getting ramped up with, Obama's first term. And yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. So bringing it back then to trauma, which is what you were talking about, there, Dan, like, there's kind of like two avenues of how this could lead to trauma. Because I'm thinking, on the one hand, we go, the people on the top, like, how does it lead to trauma? Well, it's coming from a trauma response, this like vitriol that they're having. But then also it leads to everybody else, kind of being the victims of that or the recipients of that. So yeah, when we look at this idea of propaganda and Christian nationalism and all the ways that it is coming out, how do you think that can lead to trauma? It's a really easy question, right?
Yeah. How does it not lead to trauma? No.
Right.
I think it can lead to trauma in lots of ways. I think one of the things that maybe is most traumatizing to a lot of just regular people, and here I'm not talking necessarily about the Christian nationalism, about the people who feel targeted, who are targeted, right? Is it's so big, and like, what do I do about it? The sense of powerlessness, right? The sense of helplessness. I think all of us who care about things that are going on in the country now have had that feeling, right? Or a classic one, is climate change, right? Like, it is so big and so terrifying that like any regular person can be just completely overwhelmed and be like, I can't do anything about this. Or if you're a queer kid who like now can't talk about being queer in school or is accused of like, I don't know, your mere existence is somehow pornographic or wrong or groomy or whatever. I think that that's one of maybe the most pervasive ways. And I hear that with my clients, right? That I work with at the center, of this sense of powerlessness. What do I do? How do I fight this? And I think that goes with a lot of trauma as well, right? If we could all go back in the past and fix the traumatic things that happened, we wouldn't have experienced trauma, right? We can't. We don't get to change the past. We don't get to choose our families. We don't get to, if you're I don't know why I'm on the kids, but you're the kid in school hearing these things, you don't even get to vote, right? And I think that that's maybe, for me, one of the biggest ways is that sense of powerlessness and a lack of control that does make one a victim, and that does, I think, heighten that sense of traumatic experience.
Yeah.
I think that's important. What you were just describing of like, because I think what ends up being trauma for a lot of folks is the not having or not being able to exercise that autonomy, of not having agency to, or having somebody who's taking up for you. And a lot of cases of like these kids who are marginalized identities and are now being targeted as well. Like, almost like you said at the beginning, how could it not lead to trauma in so many cases? It's like, it's almost the inevitable.
Yeah. I've heard, I had a friend of mine say once, the opposite, choice is the opposite of trauma, because when we're in those traumatized, activated spaces, we aren't able to choose what is happening. It's our survival, that is online and activated and kind of like making the choices for us. But that powerlessness goes into that as well, because when I feel like I don't have choices, then I feel powerless, and that activates my nervous system into that survival space, and and then all the consequences of that, which I feel like is so pertinent right now, just given the political climate and the fact that all of us work with people who are coming out of or recovering from high control religions, highly triggered. I'm curious to know, because at the time of recording this, we still have time till the election, right? But it's already happening. It's already in my sessions. I'm sure it's probably in your sessions as well, as different things are happening. I'm curious to know what y'all are seeing showing up in your office, going like, hey, I thought I left this. And here we are. It's like a cultural movement, and it's triggering. It can feel like it's bringing up all that old stuff that we thought we had left behind.
I mean, well, just anecdotally, what I'm seeing, I mean, it's, I think one of the most common threads that I've seen, that I've heard, is disconnect with like parents, like of an older generation. Like that's one thing I hear a lot of, where it's like, and this is not any one person I'm talking about, this is kind of a collection of just generally what I hear. Like, for example, like I, go over to dad's house on the weekend, and like all he ever has on is like Fox News, for example, and I try to talk to him about these things, and it's just like in one ear and out the other, and it's almost like, they might, something like, he's always been a hard guy to talk to, always been a little emotionally aloof, but now it's almost like I have no common ground with him anymore. I don't even know Like, I feel like I've lost my family, kind of that kind of narrative. And just multiply that. Like, I have lost count at how many folks I've heard say some variation of that narrative, where it's almost like younger folks have kind of feeling like very disconnected from, it's usually the older generation, but yeah, just very disconnected.
So Andrew's been working with my clients, apparently. Like, I don't know how I feel about that. No, I think that's a huge one, is the disconnect with, maybe it's a sibling, almost always it's parents, whatever. And what do we do with that? And just spending a lot of time with clients trying to help them figure out, like, what do they want to do with that? Like, what are they looking for? What do they think they can get in those relationships? Is it worth the cost? Whatever. But I think tied in with that, another piece is also just the too much of it, right? That they want to be engaged. They want to pay attention to what's going on. I get a lot of clients who have come out of that background and are now really opposed to it, and they want to engage the world. They want to engage politically. They want to do something different, but it's like a fire hose just hitting them in the face, the information and so just telling clients that it's okay to care, but to turn that off sometimes, right? And that you don't have to try to drink the entire hose. Like, you can turn it down. And as silly as it may sound, maybe not, given that it uses your internal family systems theory, but the new movie Inside Out 2, there's this line in there in the end where I hope I'm not blowing the movie for people that want to go see it, but where the character Joy has been kind of marginalized, right? The kid's like in adolescence now and has all these other things like ennui and all this other stuff that they're experiencing. But there's this like beam of light or like sparkly light that comes toward Joy, and they say, what is she doing? They say she's reaching for joy. And it's this model of like this kid is like trying actively to recover her joy. And it's a really beautiful image of like what people have to do. And one of the things I have to work with clients about is you've got to balance that fire hose with things that bring you joy, with things that create alternative affect to the fear or the anger or the isolation or the loss, grieving the loss of a religious community, of a family member, of whatever that is. And so I think that's another theme, is just really working with clients to be like, it's okay to care, but to monitor how much energy you put into that. Or better yet, the fact that you're like, you know what, I got to just not listen to, I'm not going to watch the news today or check, click on the sites. That doesn't mean you don't care. It means that you've got to find something that you've got to balance that caring with things that bring you joy and things that make you feel good, and whatever that is and whoever that is.
Yeah. I wonder, I didn't warn you for this, but could you speak a little bit to like the idea that comes to mind is grief of family, if you've got your client or somebody who's watching their family member get swept up into this propaganda that's claiming it's the Christian thing to do. It's what their higher power would want them to be in order to be a true believer, which feels maybe nothing like the faith of their origin. Just kind of speaking to like the process of grief that happens when we're watching this, knowing that it's also disconnecting relationships. As our family members or friends are getting wrapped up into this propaganda cycle that, doesn't maybe allow for the relationships that we used to have with them.
Yeah, the first thing to say is that it's real, right? And I tell clients that because I think clients sometimes think that, I don't know, that's a weird thing to feel, or they'll be like, I don't know if this makes any sense, but I almost feel like, and I'm like, no, it makes complete sense. And like, you're not alone. Like, everybody I talk to feels that. I've got some of that in my own life, relationships that just don't work. And I think one is helping them to just validate that that's a real thing and that's a real thing to feel. I think another one is the recognition that these are adults who are making these choices, right? And my clients, some of my clients are really, really self-aware, and they recognize that my parents do this because the way they were brought up and the traumas and they're aware that this is their own trauma response and whatever. And there's some compassion there, and they don't know what to do with that. But one of the things I tell them sometimes is, I'm like, you're right, but you're here doing this. You're here trying to break this cycle of trauma. You're trying to break out of that high control, damaging religion. And until they're ready to do that, you can't in the sense of you shouldn't, but also you are not able to take responsibility for the actions and the beliefs of another grown person. As much as we want to take those on, we can't. We are not capable of doing that. And just helping them to kind of work through that and where they go with that. And recognizing that it can be a real loss. I've got some clients, Andrew, and I'm sure you do too, are in different places. Some are like, oh, I can maintain that very superficial relationship that I now have with my parents, and if that's all it is, then okay. Other people are like, that kind of relationship isn't what I want. So if they can't take me as I am and avoid this, then I think I just don't get to have a relationship with that person anymore. And really grieve. It's okay to grieve. It's okay to feel that sorrow and that grief and that loss. It's a real loss, but it's also okay to work your way through that and to recognize that it's like an anchor that will just drag you down if you tie yourself to it. But it's really complex. I think it's probably one of the most common things that I spend time just helping people think through. I don't have any magic answers for it, just helping each of them map out kind of where they're at with that and where they want to go and how they think they can get there. And then, kind of working our way toward that.
Yeah.
I hear that a lot too. Those sorts of things. And definitely grief is a lens that I definitely have brought up before, because like you said, it's like if, you can't, first of all, if they're a grown person, like they're going to make the choices they're going to make.
Yeah.
And, maybe depending on the nature of the relationship, maybe they're open to an actual good faith discussion. I don't know. But I know in a lot of cases, especially when it's political or religiously charged, it's not so much the case. And so it's like really putting our energy into, figuring out what your values are. What is it that you care about? What is it that you need? What is it that you want? And then also just honoring this other person as they get to decide that too for themselves. And unfortunately, that might mean this relationship is not going to be what it was before, and maybe never will be again. And I know, and that's hard. I mean, understandably, that's very hard, especially when it's a parent or a sibling.
Yeah, I agree. That idea. I think we now call it ambiguous loss. Am I maybe the new DSM term, or complicated grief? Essentially like grieving the living. Which is, sometimes so much more difficult. So I know we're kind of talking about some deep stuff, but I wanted to steal a segment from Straight White American Jesus, because amidst all of this, there has to be hope somewhere. So what would you say is the reason for hope in all of this?
I don't know if it's all of this, but I'm, for me, the political season is like 2 inches in front of my face, and that's what I'm thinking of. But I'm not here to plug Kamala Harris. I'm not here to say that that's going to be magic and that everything's going to be perfect if Trump's not elected, et cetera, et cetera. But we've been talking a lot about affect. We've been talking a lot about emotion, and watching a campaign that's very explicitly and strategically emphasizing joy. We've been talking about joy, has been really, it's like a breath of fresh air, to kind of just open the window and let this breeze in and see crowds that are joyous, and to see, yes, Kamala Harris laughs, and she has a profound laugh, and like, good, awesome, like laughing. It occurred to me once, I asked somebody, I said, have we ever seen Donald Trump smile? And I don't know that literally I've ever seen Donald Trump smile. I'm positive I've never seen him laugh. It's just completely foreign, right? It's weird. Like Laura's making faces like that can't possibly be, but like we're all like cataloging through and now I'm going to be wrong. And it turns out, yes, there are pictures of Trump smiling, but we get the idea, right? That emotion, and that has felt hopeful, right? To like, because this is the other side. I said earlier, maybe I should pick this up. Anger can feel really good. It can feel. But you can't stay there, right? Doctors know this and know all the negative effects that happen if you walk around just angry all the time and how this weighs on us. I have experienced in my own life what it feels like to set anger aside, or to be able to metabolize it, or to get beneath it, or whatever metaphor we want spatially to get it out and to feel something else and to be like, oh my gosh, this is like, and I have felt that for the first time in a long time in our public political discourse. And I think there's real power to it. I have found that really, really hopeful.
Yeah. Using your inside out, reference, except I'll go back to Inside Out 1.
Yeah.
The first one. There's a powerful scene where the emotions of joy and sadness are riding together, looking back at a memory, and joy is saying, isn't it so great? You know, like, look at Riley, the main character, is being celebrated by all of her friends and family, and sadness goes, but do you know why she's able to celebrate? And she kind of like rewinds back the memory, and you see that she has lost the winning goal for her hockey team and is so down in the dumps, and and just feeling terrible at herself. And she's probably feeling ashamed. She's probably feeling some anger and sadness for sure. And then her friends and family all come around her and love her, and there's connection. And the reason she's able to feel joy is because she allowed herself to feel sadness. I always get emotional about that because I think it's just such a great visual. But I feel like there's been such a lot of sadness over the last many, many years. So yes, seeing the joy, it feels like it's more accessible because when you've felt the sadness, like the joy is also possible to feel in its fullest extent. And like social media has become fun again. Like I love scrolling threads in particular. I think I find myself laughing because it's just so fun. And I don't know. I love the joy piece. That feels really, really relevant.
Yeah. No, I agree. I love that. It makes me think of, well, first to that point, it's like I've seen that too. I think I've seen just over the past 6 months or so, I've really been noticing it, I guess. And I do feel like, both from a political perspective, but also just personally, just people that I work with and everything. There's a lot more people that are, well, first of all, that are also just being very intentional about their own healing and growth, first of all. Yeah. But to what you were just saying, and a lot more people that are really orienting their lives and their decisions around, this sounds like such a clinical term, but value-driven action. Doing things because it's what they care about, something because they care about, rather than doing things because it's this thing that we're afraid of and we're reacting out of fear and avoidance. Like I see a lot of, so like joy, and that's just like the perfect example of that. Like I do see a lot of people that are making decisions because it's something they care about, rather than it's something because we're just trying to avoid this other thing that's distressing. And it's a subtle shift, but when you start to see it on a societal level, it's huge. Yeah.
Powerful. That's so good. Well, Dan, thank you so much for joining us today. I can think of like 17 other topics I would like to talk about based off of this conversation, but I will wait or put them in an email for you. But if people want to connect with you, follow your work, work with you, like, where can they find you? How do they get in touch?
Yeah, so I'm old school still, so email is always like the most direct way. But a couple to use it. Yeah, I've got the podcast, Daniel Miller Swaj, Daniel Miller SWAJ at Gmail, and I check that. And also through the center. It's a long email, but it makes sense. It's Dan at traumaresolutionandrecovery.com through the center. So always love hearing from people. It can take me a while to get back to them because I get a lot of emails and I do what I can. But yeah, love to hear from folks and do a lot as we go into this. Yeah, it's pretty. I don't know what to call the next few months, but yeah. Would love to hear from folks.
Whirlwind, chaos, yes. And you have your podcast, Straight White American Jesus, which is available anywhere?
Available anywhere. People get podcasts, straightwhiteamericanjesus.com. They can look at that. We have a lot of content we put out. Brad Onishi is my co-host on the weekly roundup that we do. I do a series called It's in the Code, sort of decoding elements of sort of popular American religion. And different things like that. So yeah, I'd certainly invite people to check us out there as well.
Yeah, I agree. Definitely give them a listen, follow, subscribe, do all the things that you do with podcasts that you love, because it is the one, well, along with my reality TV podcasts, it is the other staple of my week is listening to Straight White American Jesus. So, it's Bravo and Swaj,
There's the t-shirt right there.
Yes, exactly. Okay, trademark. Yeah. But Dan, thank you so much for joining us today. Anything else that you want to share before we're done?
No, I just wanted to say thanks for having me. And again, like your podcast and the work that you're doing, through this podcast, through the centers, through all the things that you do, is hugely important. And thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you again to Dan Miller for joining us for an amazing conversation. I thought that was great. I could have talked for a lot longer. Like, I had so many questions and topics coming up. But what did you think, Andrew?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, I'm right there with you. I could have just, that topic it's such an interesting topic for me. I mean, both from a trauma-informed perspective, but also just being a history nerd and seeing kind of this surge of nationalism again. And there have been other times in the past century where we've seen surges of nationalism and just seeing kind of the socio-political movements and how they play out. It's anyway, really interesting. And I love talking about it. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I agree. I'm not as much of the history buff as you are, but that's why I'm always like, oh yeah, tell me what were those things. But I think it is fair to say, okay, dare I quote the Bible here? There is nothing new under the sun, which I can't. Is that like Ecclesiastes or something? But like in terms of Dan was saying it too. The evangelicalism kind of has promoted this message of God is coming again, Jesus is coming again, and they've been promoting this message for thousands of years now. And we see it play out, then in this fear, in this propaganda, in this way to try to kind of control the narrative and the culture to do what they think is right, and I have a lot of empathy for that because I used to be in that, but I now just feel so grateful to not have to be living in fear and anger all the time. And I think that Dan did such a good job talking about, just why that is and even then why an election cycle like this can bring that all back up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's definitely something that I haven't heard it talked about that much. I mean, just the tie-in with like trauma specifically with all of this. And I think it is something so important just to be having these conversations and I really, and also this was my first time ever meeting Dan.
Oh, it was?
Virtually,
yeah.
But nonetheless, yeah. So that was a lot of fun getting to talk to him directly.
Yeah, I love their podcast. So I don't know if you listen to it, but I've been listening for years now. Straight White American Jesus. People, if you haven't listened to it, I highly recommend it. They have a whole back catalog of amazing episodes. Of course, we've talked with Brad Onishi, who's the other co-host of that podcast, and he did a great series called The Orange Wave, where he looked at the history of Christianity, religion, and politics, how they kind of got into bed with one another. And the orange is not because of Donald Trump's skin color. The orange comes from Orange County, California. He tracks it all the way back to like the 50s and 60s, coming out of Orange County, California, and how it kind of took a wave over the country. So highly recommend that. But also would love to just kind of recommend that people get involved however you want to with this election cycle. It's like we would encourage people to get registered to vote and to take part in that because you can. But I think there's so many other ways too that go beyond just casting a ballot.
Yeah, I agree. I know a lot of times folks will talk about getting out to vote, and usually we're talking about the general election with the presidency on the line, and that's valid. But there's so many things too when it comes to just like local office, like school board, like just stuff like that. Quite frankly, is going to have more of a day-to-day impact on your community than anybody else. And so, and really, I think the big thing is just the big emphasis I like to take is just this is like it's community building. It's making connections with other folks that live in the same part of the world that you do. And I really do just find a lot of value in that for so many reasons. So definitely encourage people to get out to vote, or if not vote, but get involved somehow.
Yeah. Yeah, I love it. Well, I think this was a wonderful episode. Any other final thoughts from you, Andrew?
I don't. I probably already said this, but just that, I mean, I am glad to be having these conversations. I think they're incredibly important. And I also just appreciate having Dan on and talking with you too. And just the nuance of trauma, like the way trauma works, the way that it shows up in the body. Because I mean, I think there's been lots of needed conversations about, Christian nationalism or about trauma, but really the intersection of the two and how that trauma and the way that it shows up in the body is a very significant piece of how nationalism is able to operate. I think that is a really important lens that I've not heard a lot of other folks talk about, not to this extent.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I'm so glad we're having these conversations too. And I'm excited for that. The entire month of October, we've been able to kind of tackle this in a different way to really help people see this connection of religious trauma in politics, but really with the trauma piece and helping us better understand what's going on, what has been going on, in the past, in the present, in the future, and hopefully feel a bit more supported by it.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I think this has been a great episode, and maybe then, all God's people said, Amen.
Amen.
Every time I laugh. It's all good.